Today is Sunday, March 29th, 2015. My name is Jessica Brown, and I'm interviewing Rolando Rios for the Voces Oral History Project in Pearsall, Texas. So I want to start out by talking a little bit about your childhood and where you grew up.
Okay.
So where did you grow up at?
I grew up in San Antonio, west side of San Antonio, Texas.
Okay. And first, what do you identify as? Would Mexican American be?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Hispanic, Latino, Mexican American.
So can you tell me what a typical childhood was like for a Mexican American growing up in San Antonio?
Well, we grew up in the west side of San Antonio. It's a very poor area, and the most dominant language we spoke was Spanish. And basically, I didn't start speaking English till I was in high school. My mother never spoke never spoke English. She spoke Spanish all her life, and my father spoke Spanish all his life. And it was a poor area of the west side of San Antonio.
Did they ever learn any English, or
They learned very little English. My mother could not speak very well in English. She was mostly Spanish.
And did you experience any discrimination growing up being Hispanic?
Well, I did see it. I was a little unique because appearance-wise, I'm German-Irish. My mother, at birth, my mother had blonde hair, blue eyes, light-skinned like you. And at birth, she was adopted by a Mexican family on the west side who had no kids. My mother was probably born from an unwed mother, maybe a teenager from Fredericksburg, Texas, German-Irish. Back then, when teenagers would get pregnant, they would send them off to have a baby and then come back. And so at birth, when she gave birth, they gave her to a Mexican family on the west side. And so culturally, she's totally Mexican, American, but blood-wise, she's totally German-Irish. And doesn't speak any English, just Spanish, because culturally she's Spanish.
And so your father was?
My father was Spaniard. He was more of a tall, light-skinned Spaniard, but he was Mexican. And the reason I'm answering the question, because you asked me, did I experience discrimination? I saw it a lot, but I was kind of treated a little different because I didn't look Hispanic. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of like inside looking out, but not experiencing what a lot of my friends did.
Were your parents politically affiliated at all?
No, they were mostly just trying to earn a living and raising a family.
And I guess that didn't really have any influence then on you?
No, other than for watching them struggle and watching them, like I said, for example, getting the supplemental Social Security after my father was shot. I was growing up, I was going, how did that happen? And I began to realize that it was because of what Washington did.
Can you explain that a
little
bit more?
What happened was my father was killed when I was 7. And my mother was left widowed with 4 kids, me and 3 older sisters. And we had no visible means of income. But we were the first family in San Antonio, Texas, and actually across the state, to qualify for supplemental Social Security. This happened in August of 1952, and the Democrats had just passed supplemental Social Security. And supplemental Social Security was money, and even today works. If somebody experiences a catastrophic event, a family with children, that the main breadwinner is incapacitated or dies or whatever, they will get supplemental Social Security until the child is 18. So my mother got to receive a check for me from 7 till I was 18, which allowed me to stay in school.
Do you remember them voting at all? You said your mom voted.
My mom was somewhat generally involved in encouraging us to vote, but I don't know that she ever voted.
And were there any other Mexican American political leaders while you were growing up that you were aware of?
Well, mostly, I became more aware of them, and mostly in the latter parts of high school and then through college. I became more aware of how important, there was an activist movement to getting Latinos involved in politics.
So, when did you decide that you wanted to become a lawyer?
Well, I think probably as I was getting into my, getting ready to graduate from college, and then I got drafted. Because I remember in high school thinking Vietnam, they were talking about the Vietnam War, it was in the early 60s, mid 60s, and I used to think to myself, why do I care about Vietnam? It's halfway around the world. How could it possibly affect me? So I didn't want to pay attention. Well, 4 years later, when I'm getting out of college, I'm on a plane on the way to Vietnam, where people are going to be trying to kill me, and it's affecting me in a very close and personal way. So that's when I started to decide. That's when I decided, you really got to decide. You really got to know what's going on in the world, especially in Washington, because people make decisions that affect your life in a very close and personal way. I was affected when I was a child, and my father was killed. All of a sudden, the government's helping me because of somebody making a decision in Washington that affected my life in a close personal way. And then later on, when I'm on my way to Vietnam, somebody in Washington made a decision that it was going to affect my life in a very close and personal way. The first instance was in a very positive way. The second was more of a negative way. In any case, when I came back from Vietnam, I decided I wanted to get into politics, and the best way to do that is to get into law school.
So, do you know about how old you were when you went to law school? Because
Yes,
you had
I do.
already been.
I had, like I said, I graduated from college at 22. I was in the military, and I think I came back from the military. So I was a disabled veteran. The military paid for my law school, books, tuition, and everything. And I was probably 27 when I started college, law school.
And you were given the opportunity to intern at MALDEF?
I was. When I came back from the military, there was a lot of activism at the time for Latinos, so I decided to work at MALDEF, Mexican American Legal Defense Fund. And while I was there, I had a recruiter from Georgetown that was coming down looking for Latinos from South Texas to go to law school in the Northeast. And I had been stationed at Fort Meade, Maryland before I went to Vietnam in D.C., which Fort Meade, Maryland is right across from the NSA in D.C. And I got to know D.C. very well. I'd never traveled outside of Texas until I was in the military. And so I always thought to myself, I'd like to go to law school there. And so when I came back and the recruiter came by and says, you want to go to Georgetown? I said, I'd love to go to Georgetown. So he said, go ahead and apply and we'll get you in. So that's how I ended up in D.C.
Can you talk a little bit about being in Vietnam and what that was like?
Well, it was a crazy time. There was demonstrations. There was a lot of rioting on the streets.
In Vietnam?
No, in America.
In
there was a lot of tension in America because there was a lot of displeasure with the Vietnam War. We were losing. I mean, can you imagine losing 500 troops a week?
No.
On Friday, you'd see the news station, 500 Americans were killed in Vietnam this week alone. We ended up losing 52,000 young Americans between the ages of 18 and 27. And so there was a lot of displeasure with what was going on. And I was in the military. I had gotten my commission. And I was a lieutenant in Fort Meade, Maryland. I got my orders to go to Vietnam. And one of the things that affected me the most was when I got there, I would say 75% of my platoon was either Latino or African American. So what's going on here? That was kind of shocking. But yeah, it was, but I was only there 3 months. It was nothing heroic. I was a passenger in a vehicle. I got hurt, medevaced, and I was in the hospital for 9 months. I was at in Cam Ranh Bay, which is right by the South China Sea, and that's where I was stationed.
Why do you think there was so many Latinos and African Americans?
Well, and I'm sure there's some of that today. A lot of times the military is a way out of poverty to some extent. And Back then we had the draft, and unless you were politically connected or had some resources, you were going to get drafted, and the people that had more connections could get out of it, or could end up like George W. Bush in the air military, protecting Texas against the Mexican invasion. I mean, you know, that kind of stuff. So unless you had those kind of connections, and mostly the poor, the black, the Hispanics didn't, so they ended up over there.
While you were there, were you aware of what was going on in the States?
Well,
or
I
you
was.
saw it before you left?
I was to some extent, because I remember right before I went to Vietnam, I was stationed in Fort Meade, Maryland. There was riots, and there was like the Chicago 7 and all those people that were they went to D.C. and they were gonna shut down the government. And we got mobilized to go into Washington, D.C. with the military. I had a whole platoon, I was in a Jeep, and to go into D.C. and try to control the riots. So I was very aware of it, but I was on the military side.
What did you face any discrimination when you got back?
You mean like because of my military, or what?
Well, yeah, because of just being in Vietnam.
I felt a little bit of, there was a lot of mixed feelings towards military people that served in Vietnam, a lot of the anti-war movement. There was mixed feelings. Some people didn't like us because we were in the military. We were just doing what we were told. And some people had a lot of respect for us. So it was kind of mixed. One of the reasons that I think I got into law school is because they wanted to have people that had served in the military. So that was a positive thing. Plus I was Latino, and the Northeastern schools wanted to have Latinos. And the fact that I was older, I was 27. I wasn't a 21-year-old kid that just started law school. So those things were to my benefit. So
while you were going to law school in the Northeast, and there weren't that many Hispanics, was that any kind of experience for you, or did you just kind of fit in?
I fit in, but I had a lot of the students had a lot of respect for us because we had served in the military. But we were mostly focusing on getting educated, learning the law, because it's very first, second year law school is very immersing. You really don't, and that was a time when Richard Nixon was getting ready to be impeached, the Watergate hearings and all that, and that's when he resigned. That's when I was in the middle of law school. So it was a lot of that stuff going on at the same time. So very interesting times.
And so, what exactly did you do after you graduated and you were interning at MALDEF?
Okay. I interned as MALDEF, and then they recruited me, and then I was in D.C. going to law school. Then I did some MALDEF work there too. And then right after law school, I came back to San Antonio, and Southwest Voter Registration Project was working on projects together with MALDEF enforcing the Voting Rights Act, filing civil rights lawsuits. And Willie Velasquez, who was the director of Southwest Voter Registration, wanted to have his own legal arm, so he hired me to be the legal director for Southwest Voters. And I worked together with Legal Aid and MALDEF in a joint effort to enforce the Voting Rights Act in Texas.
Did you personally witness any of what was going on with like people that were being affected by the Voting Rights Act? Or? Oh,
absolutely. People think that, well, the discrimination was directed at keeping you from voting. That's not, the discrimination was a lot more sophisticated. People think they can go vote. I voted, and then you leave. I voted. My right to vote is protected. That's not enough, because what they had was systems like gerrymandering, where you'd pack all the minorities in one district and had at-large election systems. There are all kinds of devices so that if you went to vote, you could vote, but it really wouldn't mean anything. For example, in at-large voting, the white majority controls everything. So you could go and vote as much as you want to. You could get everybody to vote, but since majority ruled, the minority's interest or vote were basically negated. So what I'm saying is that there were devices, legally enforceable devices that were used to eviscerate your right to vote as a Hispanic or an African American.
Did that, was that happening all over Texas?
All over Texas.
And
Texas.
was it in other states too?
Oh yes, but we focused in San Antonio. I mean, we focused in Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and some parts of California.
So I found a statement that you had said while you were representing the Southwest Voter Registration Education Project, where you talk about the minority language provisions and how they would have helped, but they helped some, but they would have been more effective if the law was enforced. Can you talk about that?
Yes, what would happen is they'd have the language requirement, and then when people would go vote, they wouldn't have it in the language so they could understand it. So a lot of times they were voting in the blind. That was one thing. And then of course the other thing is when you did vote, you would vote in, for example, a gerrymandered district where, let's say the Hispanics were entitled to 2, 3, or 4 of the seats for the city council, school board, or the commissioner's court. But they would pack them all in one district so that you would only get one elected, where you may statistically wise, you may have been entitled to 3 or 4.
So did you actually go and like testify in Washington?
I did. I went to Washington on getting the Voting Rights Act passed. I was counsel for Southwest Voter, and Willie Velasquez, who was the director, I prepared him for the testimony, and we went up there and testified and helped pass the Voting Rights Act to cover Texas.
Did you notice right away after it was passed that things changed, or did they?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, fast in the sense that, for example, you go to La Mesa, Texas, which is a small community west of Lubbock. The community was 45, almost 50% Latino, but they had no Latinos on the commissioner's court, city council, school district, or college district. College districts elect 7, city council elects 5, school board elects 7, and the county government elects 4. So you're talking about 7, 14, about 25 elected positions. I sued all of them because they gerrymandered the commissioner's court, and then the other 3 were at large. So I sued all of them, and they would force the redistricting of the county, where you would give at least 1 district to Latinos. In that case, they would divide the Latinos into 4 districts, so they're not a majority in any of them. So I would sue them, create immediately 1.5 districts. So overnight you get 1 Latino elected. The school district, they were all at large, so I'd sue them, force single-member districts, and overnight I would create 3 Hispanic districts, and you'd have 3 board members. City council would be 2 out of 5. College district, again, 3 or 4 out of 7. So you would go from 0 representation out of 25 overnight to about 8 or 10. Dramatic, within a matter of 1 to 2 years. And all of a sudden, you have minorities sitting at the table where the college district or the school district is making decisions on bilingual education and so on. So they're at the table being able to participate. Where you had 0 representation, this is about 1980, 81, 82, and that's just one community. We did about 60-something lawsuits in the whole Panhandle area, and all of a sudden we had hundreds of locally elected officials, all because of the law. Would have never happened but for the law and the enforcement.
Did you experience or hear about any resistance after?
Oh, they would have a lot of times the plaintiffs, because you have to have a plaintiff, a person that's willing to step up and say, I want to sue the county government, I want to sue the school district. And usually they were women, because women were the ones that got to stay home. The husbands were all working, and they didn't want to get involved in anything, because let's say they worked at a mechanic shop. They would get fired. Or they worked for the county or the city. They would get fired if they filed a lawsuit. Or if they had a business. Let's say they had a car painting business. You file the lawsuit against the county, you're going to lose business, okay? And the wives were usually the strong ones. They said, look, this is good for our kids, and so on and so forth. So they would be the ones that would end up being plaintiffs, because when you sue somebody, you have to name yourself, and it comes out in the paper. And these people are not used to having their names in the paper as being activists.
Were there, was it like, I mean, how were they feeling? Like, were they just really nervous?
Very nervous, but like I said, the women were the tough ones. You know, we got to do this. And they would withstand it and fight it out. A lot of times they would get fired. A lot of times their business would hurt, would suffer. A lot of times there'd be discrimination against their kids. But they were tough. They'd tough it out. And after a few years, then they realized, the Anglos would realize, it's not the end of the world to have 2 or 3 Hispanics on the city council. So it was tough at first.
We're good.
Are there any specific cases or incidences that that stick out to you that you could talk about?
Oh, sure, like San Antonio.
Mm-hmm.
San Antonio used to have at-large elections, and we sued them. And overnight, we ended up with 3 or 4 Hispanics, which increased the turnout of Latinos in San Antonio, and culminated in the first Latino being elected, Henry Cisneros, who ended up later being Secretary of Health and Welfare. And it continues, like now we have the Castro brothers, who've been elected in Congress and mayor, and so they're going up the ranks. Yes, those are concrete, specific results. And like I said, we did, well, across the state, I remember one time I filed 16 lawsuits in one day in federal court against counties that would not redistrict their districts. Texas has 254 counties. Every county elects 4 commissioners. And those commissioners make decisions, they hire people, they set taxes and so on, so powerful positions. 254 counties, and a lot of them would not redraw their districts because they didn't want to lose. Because if you redrew them and you have too many Hispanics, they were all Anglo, okay? You had too many Hispanics, a Hispanic might run against you, and since there were so many in their district, you could lose. So they didn't want to redraw their district so that we'd have to sue them in court. Like I said, one time I ended up doing 16 of those and won all of them. And we would win, not because we were great lawyers, but because the law was so clear, and they chose to ignore it. We'd have to take them to court, and the court would say, you, commissioners, are going to have to redraw the districts immediately. The judge would have to tell them that. Then they would do it.
Did you lose any of your cases?
Did I what?
Did you lose any of the cases?
We lost very
involved?
few. And initially, like I said, it was a Voting Rights Act, it was passed, it was trickling down, and it was forcing these people to make the election systems fair. Yes, we lost a few, but like I said, 98% we would win. The big ones, like when I sued the whole state for election of judges, it would get very politically activated and so on, and sometimes we would lose 1 or 2 of those.
Would you say that the redistricting was the biggest issue you faced?
It is the only issue insofar as democracy is concerned, because how you draw the districts will determine who gets elected. I can draw a district that will make sure no Hispanics get elected, or we can draw districts to make sure that they get their fair share of the pie, because you can gerrymander either in a positive way to help promote democracy and get everybody involved, or you can gerrymander in a way to suppress the vote.
Can you talk a little bit about the La Raza Unida party?
Okay.
Was that affiliated with Malda?
Not necessarily directly, although they both evolved around the same time. Texas had 2 parties, Democrats and Republicans. And at one time, the Republican Party really was non-existent. And the Democratic Party ran everything. But the Democratic Party was run by Anglos mostly. And they would take advantage and make sure that Hispanics voted for them, but they would never draw districts so that Hispanics could elect Hispanics. And so at that point, the Raza Unida party was saying, look, we're members of the Democratic Party, and you're not giving us our fair shake. So they spun off, and it precipitated the creation of the Raza Unida party, because the Democratic Party wasn't providing responsive representation to them.
You said earlier that you somewhat identified with the La Raza Unida party.
I did, in the sense that I grew up, like I said, I saw discrimination although a lot of it wasn't directed at me because of my physical appearance, but I did see it, and I understood what the rest of the party was complaining about.
Were there any things you didn't agree with about
The
La
rest of the
Raza
party?
Unida Party?
I think maybe to some extent was the crazy part of it, where you ended up with some of our leaders being involved in drugs and so on, so that was counterproductive.
Yeah. Oh.
But you need an organization like that to push the system and make the Democrats a little more sensitive to what we needed.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of a necessary evil.
So after all of the Voting Rights Act was passed, what have you been working on since then? Do you still do the same type of?
Well, we still do a lot of the same type of thing. We have been able to make a lot of change, but every year, like in 1990, in 2000, and now in 2010, every decade, the legislature draws the districts for Congress, for the Senate, and for the State House in a way to minimize the impact of the Latino vote. For example, this last time, Texas picked up 4 new congressional districts because of the growth. We picked up, 5 million people, new people. So we ended up getting 4 new congressional districts. Most states, that was the most of any other state. New York lost 1. California didn't gain any, but Texas gained 4. A lot of it was because of the growth. 70% of the growth in Texas was because of Latinos. Well, when they drew the congressional districts, they gave us no new congressional districts. We got 36 congressional. We had 32, we went to 36. And we had like 5 or 6 congressional districts. We were entitled to another 2 or 3. Well, they didn't give us any. They drew mostly Republican districts. So we had to sue them again.
When
And we're
was
still in
this?
court. This is after the 2010 redistricting. And we're still in court. And we were able to force them to get us 1 or 2 more, and we're still in the fight to get another 1 or 2 more to get equity. If you're 40% of the population, you should have 40% of the representation at the table. And we're still fighting that.
Would you say that the problem has gotten better, or is it still the same?
The problem, what's going on is that we have more power now. We're getting some more representation, but we still don't have what you would call equity, okay? And all the power in Texas is basically Republican. There's 33 statewide elected officials, 3 railroad commissioners, 9 Supreme Court justices, 9 Court of Criminal Appeals justices. There's the governor, the lieutenant governor, the attorney general, 33 of them. How many do you think are Democrats, which represents the Latino community? None. 0. 9 Supreme Court justices, none are Democrats because of the way the system is set up. We need to sue the Supreme Court too, the state of Texas, to create districts. So we've made progress, but on a statewide basis, not much. However, I will say this, that as we become more active and more registered and more come out to vote, boom, overnight, the Democrats are going to take over the legislature. And overnight, we'll see dramatic change. Ronald Reagan was a Republican, very popular governor, Republican from California. And there used to have 2 the United States senators were all Republican and all that. Boom, overnight, the Democrats took over. The Republican Party in Texas and California basically non-existent. The senators are Democrats, the governor's a Democrat. The legislature, the Speaker of the House in California is a Latino. That's where Texas is going eventually. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Do you talk about what the work that you've done to, like, your children or just younger generations in general?
To some extent, my kids have been affected. I've been on TV shows, NPR and so on, gotten a lot of awards, and I've been in the front page of the papers and so on. So they're aware. And when I ran for Congress in '94, they were aware of my involvement in politics, and so they know, they kind of generally know the fight.
And what do you think it is important for them to know about?
Most important thing is to be aware of what's going on in the government, who's making decisions, and participate in the democratic process, because their lives will be impacted just like my life. Right now there's a lot of hot issues. There's environmental, global warming. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff, and they have to be involved. So I drill them, because we're going to be gone, and you guys are going to be saddled with the bad decisions that we make sometimes. So you have to be involved.
Do you believe in our system? Do you believe that we all have the same opportunity? Or do you think that there's limitations based on the color of your
Well,
skin?
there's still a lot of limitations here. The key is education. There's a lot of income distribution. We haven't had any increase in minimum wage. When I ran for Congress in '94, Crystal City, the guy I ran against, who was a Republican, representing Crystal City, was against minimum wage. He didn't think there should be a minimum wage. Well, that's outrageous, you know. And so there's still a lot of work to be done. Income inequality is a big issue, but I think those are the issues. That's probably going to be one of the main issues in the presidential election coming up in '16. I think Hillary would do well in that. But to answer your question directly, it's the best system that I know of. Being overseas, being in Vietnam, and seeing how a government works, where it's totally unresponsive, where it's totally controlled by a dictator or whatever. This is probably one of the best systems, if not the best system. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. In Europe, a lot of the systems there are working very well, the democratic systems that we have in Europe. So it's getting better, but it's also got a lot of big challenges.
Do you feel like you accomplished everything that, do you feel like MALDEF accomplished everything that they wanted to accomplish?
I think it's a work in progress. I think that, like I said, we're still a lot of work to do in Texas. But I think we're getting there. It's better, but it's still not where you have to be. Like I said, every inch that we get, every new congressional district for Latinos, you got to fight it tooth and nail all the way to the Supreme Court, and there's a lot of roadblocks. You've got the Supreme Court justice, a number of the Supreme Court justices. There's 4 of them that don't believe in the Voting Rights Act, that don't believe in the government being involved in helping distribute rights and provide more equity. That's a problem, because it can retard everything, slow everything down. And if you retard it too much or you suppress it too much, you're going to end up with revolution. There has to be enough room where we're able to make social change.
So you work privately now? You have your own practice?
I do. I have my own practice. Because I besides the voting rights and that stuff, I do immigration work. Immigration is very important. More and more Latinos are coming into this country. And I also do some personal injury, which makes money. You know, you can make a lot of money as a lawyer if you work in the areas like personal injury. But what happened, the advantage to me is because, like, I did a lot of voting rights all over Texas, and when I ran for Congress, so somebody gets, like when I ran for Congress, I almost went bankrupt. Well, within 3 months of that I lost the campaign, somebody called me from Midland saying, hey, my wife was killed in a car accident, blah, blah, blah. I remember you were running for Congress. Boom, in that case, I make quite a few $100,000s that helped me keep going. So the civil rights work, got my name out, and they would call me for private stuff, which would help me make money. So it's kind of worked well for me, because it's not easy making a living as a civil rights lawyer, because it doesn't pay a lot of money.
Do you do a lot of, or was a lot of the civil rights work done like pro bono?
It's not pro bono, it's called contingency. And like I said, we would win 98% of the case. When I sue the state of Texas to enforce the rights of minorities, and I win, the state of Texas or the county government or city council, they have to pay my fees. And like I said, since we won 98% of the cases, they would have to pay for my fees. That's how I kept going.
So the people
And
that
again,
you were...
it's not because I was a great lawyer, but the law was so clear, and they just didn't want to do it, because if they did what I told them to do, they could lose their job, like commissioners. If I drew the districts the way they were supposed to be drawn fair, one or two of those guys could be defeated. So they'd fight it till we go to federal court. The federal court say, you have to change it, and then they'd have to pay for my fees. And again, it's not because I was a great lawyer, but the law was so clear, and they refused to change it because social change doesn't come easy. You understand?
Mm-hmm. So those that you were representing, probably the biggest risk they were taking would be like facing discrimination or losing
Retaliation.
their retaliation.
Retaliation, and getting ostracized from the community. Like I said, I had a couple of clients who had mechanic shops or barber shops or a restaurant, Mexican restaurant, and they would get boycotted and their business would hurt.
Did you experience, or did they experience like a bounce back, like a couple years later after things?
After things settled down
down.
and the skies didn't fall, because we have a Hispanic commissioner, we have 3 school board members that are Hispanics, and they began to realize, what's wrong with having them there? They're providing input, they're members of the community. Then things settled down. But at first it's like a big shock, because they thought that the world was going to come apart and we're at a revolution and we're going to take over. And, you know, I mean, it's just, social change doesn't come easy.
Was there anything specifically that you didn't like about working for MALDA?
Well, I never really, I mean, I worked for MALDA for a little bit, but my whole career, other than those first 2 years that I worked for Southwest Voter, I worked together with MALDA.
Okay.
I never worked for them. The hard part, especially after went to private practice, was to earn a living. It's hard earning a living as a civil rights lawyer.
Were you familiar at all with the Voting Rights Act before you started working on it?
Well, the Voting Rights Act was passed originally in '65, okay?
Mm-hmm.
To cover blacks only. And it was and then it was expanded to cover Latinos in '75, which is right when I was getting involved in it. So my career has kind of coincided with the enactment of the law and developed. We basically enforced it and developed the law as my career was going forward. So it kind of grew up together, I guess you might say, with the Voting Rights Act.
So where were a lot of the people from that you represented? Was it all over? Were there specific counties that were more heavily impacted?
Mostly in the Northeast, the Panhandle area, because down in South Texas, Latinos are 90%, 95%, so they're elected commissioners, court, city council, school board, they run everything. But mostly in anywhere, if you take a line from El Paso to San Antonio down to Corpus, everything northeast of that is the areas Midland, Lubbock, Odessa, Dallas, all that area around there, lawsuits. We've had lawsuits all around there. Then you can go to Waco, coming down, Waco, Austin, some around here in San Antonio, and then all the way to Houston, Beaumont, and the east. That's where a lot of litigation occurred.
So we're in Pearsall right now. Did you have any cases?
Oh yes, Pearsall was one of the first counties that we sued to redistrict. that this was one of the counties where Hispanics were 30–40% of the population, and they had no minority representation. So I know one of the counties here was sued by MALDEF while I was working there, and there was a lot of resistance. So yes, this is one of the places where I guess it would be Frio County, LaSalle County, Pearsall. All of these counties had to be sued to create minority districts.
And now coming back, being here today, do you feel like it's
I think it's
changed
different.
a lot?
I think it's different. I was sitting there was a county commissioner out there. Latinos, there's still discrimination and there's still resistance, but it's a little, there's a lot more acceptance, and people are kind of working together better. I mean, there's still the fights, political fights and so on, but there's a lot more involvement of the Latino community. And I mean, this took 20 years, so I think the lawsuit that we filed here was probably in the early 80s. And now we have, well, I don't know if the county judge, county judge and the commissioners are all Latinos. And at one time, none of them were.
Yeah. Of the clients that you worked with, did they specifically identify as like Chicanos or Mexican Americans?
Well, a lot of the term Chicano was frowned upon by some of the middle class Latino Catholics and so on. They preferred Hispanics. Chicano was seen as kind of too much of a revolutionary. But the people that I ended up representing a lot of the, like LULAC, GI Forum, even the Catholic Church to some extent. Like LULAC was a very acceptable middle class. Middle class for Latinos is, probably lower middle class, but they saw that as an acceptable organization, more so than any, like the Raza Unida and that kind of stuff.
Why would you be representing the Catholic Church?
Well, the Catholic Church, a couple of lawsuits, they helped finance it to some extent, because the Catholic Church felt that asserting the right to votes of Latinos is something good for the community, and they would be active in trying to help the Latino community. They were kind of a social service. They were for fairness and to get Latinos more involved in the local community.
So
But normally, they normally don't get involved in politics, but there was a few instances where they would bring us in to help them make some changes.
So it wasn't something that happened all the time?
No, it was very rare. Normally it was LULAC, the NAACP, okay, the GI Forum. Like what the NAACP did all over the South, Mississippi and all those, the LULAC did here, MALDEF, GI Forum, Southwest Voters, Legal Aid, Texas Rural Legal Aid. They were all the organizations that did the work here that the NAACP did in the Deep South.
I just forgot what I was going to say.
That's okay, it happens to me all the time. What's embarrassing is when that happens in court. Yes, we're waiting. I'm having a mental relapse here, Judge. Give me a moment.
Would you say that your experiences as being a lawyer has, and what you've witnessed, has shaped your political identity?
Yes, and it started, like I said, when I was very young. The Democrats, in my perspective, well, like even when my father was killed, he was killed by a crazy person who went out and they sold him a gun without even a background check. That affected my life for the rest of my life. So a party that wants to, hey, have background checks, let's have a little more control on weapons and so on, well, that's the Democratic Party. Helping people that have kids that have no income, like supplemental Social Security, that's the Democratic Party. Helping minimum wage, have people get fair wage for their work, that's the Democratic Party. Civil rights laws, I got into law school to a large extent because of affirmative action. They wanted to have more diversity. Well, what's that? It's the Democratic Party. Where am I going to go? The Republican Party is against all of that. against all of it. So, I mean, it's a no-brainer for me because of where I came from, A lot of people have a different background. A lot of people, like people that are born with opportunities and wealth, they don't want to, they feel that if you help somebody else, it's going to take away from yourself. You know, like the very, very wealthy. So it's a different experience.
Do you feel like the things that you've experienced, and do you want your children to like be aware of those things?
I think so, and quite frankly, I'm very blessed in the sense that my kids seem to be pretty much in tune with what I grew up. I mean, I grew up. I raised them in the West, in the kind of the North, and more middle class family as they were growing up, and then when I ran for Congress, I moved over to the far north side, where it was mostly Republican. They went to Ronald Reagan, George Bush Middle School, so they saw the difference in how the whites treat Latinos, because the few Latinos that are there, and then we end up moving back here. So they've been able to see what I do and see, and then when they're over there, they saw the Republican Party and how they treat minorities, and so they're pretty solidly Democrat. I don't think they're going to vote Republican anytime soon. But so they're very supportive of Hillary. I think all three of them.
You said that you ran for Congress.
Yes.
Where at?
Here in San Antonio in '94. In 1994, I ran when Ann Richards was running for governor. I ran against Henry Bonilla, who's a Republican Hispanic who represents one of the largest districts in Texas, goes from San Antonio all the way to El Paso. And I lost.
What was that experience like?
It was okay. It was okay. I was a Democratic nominee, and I just was happy to participate in the Democratic process. But we lost. I lost in a year that no Republican lost in any place in the United States. It was the first time that Republicans took over the House during the Newt Gingrich era. The first time the Republicans took over the House in 40 years. So it was a bad time to run, but I don't regret it one bit.
Was there anything specifically that you wanted to do, like goals that you had?
Well, one of the things, yeah, of course, push for minimum wage. But one of the things, there's a happy ending to that story, because when I lost, anyway, I went back to my redistricting, and we sued the state of Texas, and we redrew that district that I lost in, made it more Democrat. And so the guy I ran against got defeated the next election because of the work that I did in redrawing the district. So I may have lost to him directly, but I make sure that he got defeated the next time.
That's funny. Is there anything else that you want to add?
No, I think by the way, you've done a very good job. We've touched all the topics. The main thing is I hope the message goes through, is that these federal laws like the Voting Rights Act are effective and they have an impact in the community. And so it's really important that the appropriate laws are passed to create social change.
Would you encourage young people today to?
Absolutely, they have to. Even if you're not involved in the political movement or in civil rights, whatever you do, if you're an engineer, or if you're doing social media like my kids are, or my youngest wants to go to law school, and I think she wants to fight for women's rights, so that's good. You have to be aware of what the parties are saying and what they're doing. Like, I really think it's important. Global warming and what's having an impact on the environment, it's really important that people are aware of what's going on and participate, because there's a strong movement, especially with the Republican Party, denying that human activity is having an impact in changing the environment. That's very dangerous. That's a very dangerous game, because the change in the environment, you can't change it overnight, and you start having these big floods and all this stuff, it could be too late. The ice is melting and the sea levels are going up, but people are dragging their feet. That's dangerous.
Is that something that you could get involved with?
I could. But right now, the problem is the politics. There's not enough politics to get a good environmental law passed, and also it's a worldwide issue. It's not just, I mean, this is the whole world's got to be involved in that. And that's your world.
Yeah.
Okay?
Well, thank you for
No
being
problem.
here. It's
And
really
thank
nice
you
to
for
meet
your questions. They're very thorough and very comprehensive, and I hope you've been able to see how it works.
Yes, I've learned a lot.
Okay.